Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment in our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by Dan Kurtz Phelan, joining us from New York. Dan is the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is, I think, almost without dispute, the most influential foreign policy magazine in the world, really. Is both authoritative and cutting edge. It's just a really important journal and for discussion of international affairs. Dan has an interesting career. He's had a long and deep interest in foreign policy. He's worked in the worlds of government and think tank and also journalism. He was a graduate of Yale. He served in the State Department's Policy and Planning Unit and has been editor of Foreign Affairs since 2021. Prior to that, he was the executive editor, did that for 3 years. And I'll say Foreign Affairs is an amazing, as I said, an amazing publication. This is its 100th anniversary, and it just recently published its Centennial issue, which we will talk about at some length. It's really an important publication. I have to say I'm a foreign affairs junkie, so I went through my files, and at home I actually have the 75th anniversary edition. Now, I don't think I have everything between 75 and 100, but it is just this really important, as I say, foreign affairs publication. Dan is also the author of a book called The China Mission about George Marshall, and I look forward to talking to him about it because it came out a couple of years ago, got lots of attention, stimulated a lot of debate, and is interesting as kind of a framework for our discussion. So plenty of things to talk about. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, John. Really happy to be here and very much appreciate that introduction.
Well, Dan, I saw an interview in which you described yourself as a foreign policy nerd. And I wonder where that started. Was this something that, began in high school? Did it intensify at Yale? Was it shaped by, teachers, reading, travel? How did you become a foreign policy nerd?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have there's no kind of like rosebud moment that I can point to in my youth where it all begins. But I spent a summer when I was in high school in southern Mexico, which I think was kind of the moment when it started. And just kind of the set of questions, I was probably 15 at the time, the set of questions that flowed from that experience, and then when I was in college, 9/11 happened, and so all of a sudden this I think a set of questions that seemed a little bit secondary to some people in the 90s and kind of post Cold War moment when some of these kind of questions of geopolitics and global security seemed like they were relics from the past, that became a really kind of formative event in shaping my thinking and interest. And I've kind of always, this foreign affairs is kind of the only place in the world where I can truly kind of indulge all my interests. But I've kind of been torn. I have a clear interest in foreign policy, and that's always been really my focus, but torn between, different ways of getting at some of these questions. So, there's an academic element to this, there's a policy and government element to this, and then there's a more kind of journalistic or editorial element to this. And, what the way I think of the magazine is that it kind of pulls all those together, right? The part of our mission is bringing, academics into the policy conversation, bringing kind of people who might be doing policy in more less public roles, into a broader policy conversation, and doing that in a way that has credibility and authority and kind of drives debate among the people who spend all their time thinking about some question, but is always kind of framed and explained and edited in a way that a much broader readership can access that debate. So it's part of it's bringing different kinds of expertise and different kinds of credibility together into one conversation. But then also we kind of think of that as a public conversation. It should be a public conversation. It is, of course, in our pages. So sorry, that's a little bit off from your question about where it started, but it's really been my kind of a career of indecision among those different ways of getting at this core question. But whether it was in my book or working in government or now at the magazine, it has all kind of gone back to that animating interest.
Well, let's talk about your time in government. You were in the policy and planning office, among other things, and which is that, in some sense, one of the most storied institutions in American diplomacy. Famously created by George Marshall. Who instructed his first head, George Tenon, to avoid trivia. And I've always been interested in the notion of policy, long-term planning in government, and of course, the famous comment by Eisenhower, plans are nothing, planning is everything. From your experience, how does is the American foreign policy structure, is it conducive to long-term planning? I mean, that sounds almost like a rhetorical question, but how does one inject some long-term planning into American foreign policy, particularly from the vantage point of policy and planning at state?
Yeah, no. I mean, the short answer is no, right? That it's not conducive to that kind of long-term planning, and I think some of that is about particular shortcomings of institutions, but I think a lot of that is just the nature of the kinds of issues that you're working on when you're sitting in one of these institutions. So the kind of the cliche is that the urgent always overwhelms the important, and that it's easy to say that you should be wary of that risk and you should avoid it. But I think it's just on a human level very, very hard when if you're a senior decision maker and you just have this flow of problems and challenges and threats or opportunities, depending on where you are. It's hard to say, look, I'm going to kind of let this is a true crisis somewhere in the world, and there's probably something that someone in the US government should be thinking or saying or doing about it, but I'm going to not spend 2 hours today on that so I can think about these long range questions. I mean, the other things you learn, I came into government and I'd done a couple other jobs in the State Department before going into the policy planning shop, but I'd spent time outside in my studies and spent time as an editor of foreign affairs before going into government when I was early in my career. And we spend a lot of time talking about ideas. We spend a lot of time looking at arguing about different strategies or different policy options on the outside and kind of working through advantages and disadvantages. And, you want to make a kind of case, lay out your theory of the case for why you think a given policy would work. You realize very, very quickly when you get into institutions, and this is, there are, I think, versions of this in lots of different fields, that the ideas are, maybe 2% of success, and then working through the implementation in these gigantic institutions, working through the bureaucratics, the political considerations are 98% of the game and 98% of what you're doing. So I think there can often be a disconnect between the debate at the ideas level and the realities of implementation and kind of getting programs formed and budgets and it's all the kind of stuff that tends to be boring in conversation. And I think that there are times when you can miss in talking about these ideas on the outside, that when you're carrying out foreign policy or implementing an idea in a government or as a part of an institution, you're kind of facing different set of decision points and trade-offs and considerations. And I think that's part of what causes a disconnect between some of the kind of long-range strategic thinking that may seem very easy when it's not, the substance is not easy, right? You can kind of lay it out in the pages of foreign affairs, but then what that means when it's, you're thinking about congressional timelines and politics and just the kind of bureaucratic process, I think becomes a much greater challenge. This was part of my, we can talk about the book later on, and thank you very much for the kind words on that. But part of what drove me to write this book was having spent time in policy planning where George Marshall and George Kennan are kind of haunt you every day. And in the one of the first things that the policy planning office did was help shape the Marshall Plan in the late 40s when George Marshall was Secretary of State. And there's this sense that there was this kind of golden age, right? There's much mythologized age of American foreign policy and American leadership, and some of this is about World War II and the Greatest Generation. Some of this is about the Marshall Plan and some of the kind of achievements of American statecraft in the early post-World War II years and early Cold War. All of that just kind of looms over everything you do in foreign policy now, in the sense that, there was a golden age when American foreign policy really did big things. It was ambitious. And part of what I wanted to do in this book was to look at two a legitimately great figure from that era. My book is not an attempt to kind of bring George Marshall down exactly, but to look at a kind of struggle and a failure of American foreign policy in that period, because that's much more kind of what you're dealing with in these jobs and with these issues. So there's some sense in which there was a time when we really knew how to do long range planning and strategy, but in some ways the book is about the limitations of that even in the golden age.
Great. Well, we will come back to that in a bit, but let's talk about foreign affairs. And it's and I guess I'm going to refer to it kind of in the singular, but as you pointed out, I mean, it's evolved into a very kind of a multi-dimensional institution. I mean, you have the printed publication that comes out every 6 a year, so every other month, and then you have an online foreign affairs that has fresh articles every day. And then you have a podcast, the Foreign Affairs Interview, which I've watched a number of them where you've interviewed people like, the Secretary of State, the UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, major thinkers and so forth. So there's a lot of dimensions to foreign affairs, but I want to touch on its kind of founding mission. And your first predecessor, Mr. Coolidge, in the first edition of Foreign Affairs said, the magazine will tolerate wide differences of opinion. Its articles will not represent any consensus of belief. What is demanded of them is that they shall be competent and well-informed, representing honest opinions, seriously held and convincingly expressed. Talk about the type of debate and the type of articles that you want foreign affairs to represent or to project to the world.
Yeah, well, thanks for reading that quote, because it's something that we think about a lot and still does very much kind of shape the way we think about our mission. And I think there are a couple dimensions to this. And one, if you go back to that first issue in September 1922, almost exactly 100 years ago, part of the mission and part of what they laid out in those early issues was that this needed to be a public conversation in different ways. So this seems, kind of obvious or intuitive to many people now, but in 1922, the fact that discussion about foreign policy and about international affairs needed to have a much broader reach into the citizenry and among voters in a democracy, and that was a big part of it. So that public mission, right? This is not just for people who are sitting in the State Department or in the military or in universities, but should have a much broader reach. But then also that this should be about facilitating and driving a constructive debate about major events in the world. So as we see, I think about what makes something a foreign affairs essay in the print magazine or an article online or a podcast or anything else, it should have a kind of ambition to start or reshape or change or reframe a debate about a major issue in American foreign policy or international affairs. And along with that ambition, you should get a real credibility of authorship. So we're not a journalistic outlet. It's not about finding the most fluent writer on something or someone who goes out and reports. It's about saying who brings kind of unique credibility to this, as it could be as a practitioner, someone who comes out of a government role, or it could be a business role or an NGO role. It's not always government. It could be someone who brings academic credibility to it. So the person who has done the best research on something. And I often stress in this context, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the, emeritus professor who's the giant of the field, who's been doing this for 50 years. There are times when we'll say, who knows the most about, I'll try to think of a recent example, staffing problems in the Russian military. And that might be someone who has, is not a household name, who's been studying that very, very intensively, and suddenly the credibility that has been gained through what might be a few years of work rather than decades and decades establishes that person as the kind of authority that we would go to. So you have the credibility, but then there's also if I take any major issue, we want to make sure that we are working through the major arguments, and that doesn't mean you need to represent every perspective in a kind of both sides way, right? It's not everything is not should we bomb Iran or should we not bomb Iran, but trying to say what are the kind of questions that are not being addressed, what are the fault lines in this policy discussion that might not be totally explicit, and trying to kind of use the pieces that we do in the magazine, on the website, or discussions we have in the podcast over time to really kind of drive those debates forward in as constructive a possible way. So that should mean diversity in a range of senses, right? And in the partisan sense, which is one dimension that they get at in those early issues. It doesn't just mean you have to have necessarily like a Republican and Democratic view on something, which doesn't really capture it, but to say, look, if we look at the debate about China policy now, there are different fault lines and different assumptions, and we should be kind of testing those and surfacing those. So if you read Foreign Affairs over the course of a year or two, you will get a really kind of smart but also fairly comprehensive sense of what the debate on China policy is and should be. So you won't read Foreign Affairs and say, okay, I've got I've heard the right answer on what the U.S. should do when it comes to a question like China policy, but I've seen this range of perspectives and arguments represented, and people can come to their own conclusions, but they should have a kind of real sense of how that debate plays out over time.
Well, I mean, Foreign Affairs has had some just remarkable essays over the last 100 years. I mean, and I know in this last year, you've republished a number of them in the context of your anniversary. And I mean, just almost who's who in global affairs has written articles over the last 100 years, as well as, less prominent people at the time, but really important scholars. And you wrote in, I think, the introduction to your Centennial issue, you say, thousands of articles have appeared in these pages. Many have, for good and ill, helped shape the course of U.S. foreign policy in international relations, perhaps most famously George Kennan's X article, which laid out Washington's Cold War strategy of containment. Others have challenged the thrust of policy or questioned assumptions about the world. All have taken up the basic challenge to seek to drive a debate that by design spans practitioners, experts, and a much broader engaged readership in the United States and around the world. So just in a moment, talk about just the impact foreign affairs has had on American foreign policy, but world diplomacy. I mean, from Kennan's X article to Samuel Huntington's Class of Civilizations. I mean, as you think of just the reach of foreign affairs, what comes to your mind?
I mean, so I love the example of the Kennan X article, not just because it was, in fact, so influential in shaping both the internal policy in the U.S. government strategy, but also public debate about Cold War strategy, and really, kind of loomed over those debates and those questions for decades. But it's almost, I said for good or for ill. There are people who, I think even George Kennan might come away from that experience saying, I shaped U.S. policy for ill, because George Kennan, as people may know, wrote this piece kind of framing the strategy of containment, and then spent decades and decades arguing that everyone had misunderstood what he was saying and kind of were misapplying it. So in the context of, the Vietnam War, George Kennan was a critic of the Vietnam War. He was out of government at that point. And there were people who would say, no, this is about containment. And George Kennan, the kind of, intellectual progenitor of the idea, would say, no, you're totally misunderstanding containment. So you can see in the legacy of that article, the way that it can, really shape and define debate in many ways, but then be argued over for years and years. And we've had, probably scores of articles in Foreign Affairs in the years since, kind of arguing about what containment is and should be. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Now you have another round of this in the context of both U.S. competition with China and Russia now. So these become kind of points of argument over many years. But when I think another strength of that piece is that it did have influence both inside government and among people who were shaping these decisions in a policy sense, but also shape public debate. And there's a both sides of that are essential, and the fact that you're shaping public debate in some ways feeds into the way that strategy is formed in government. So the fact that a piece like that can speak to both of those audiences in some sense, I think is part of what makes it so powerful. And it's something we try to do with almost every article we do. You rarely get that level of success, but kind of thinking about that and in those terms, at least I think hopefully we get there sometime still.
Yeah, I've thought about just like, how someone from your vantage point might analyze articles. And I mean, just kind of a quick list, which is not exhaustive or even mutually exclusive. It's like, okay, it's a successful article. Does it provoke an intense debate immediately? Does it spark a protracted debate, maybe over decades, as in the case of Kennan? Does it change the terms of the debate? Does it introduce new ideas or a framework? Is it just a succinct summary of the current state of affairs? And I know you're also very focused on, as you say, not just admiring the problem, but putting forth possible solutions. So as you analyze articles and kind of review them as you do your work, is it that whole blend of criteria that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, it is all part of it, and there are different, I think every article should have some, all of those objectives in part, but the balance among them changes a lot just depending what the individual piece is. And, you mentioned the solving the problem point, that to me is an important part of this. That is the other criterion. If you're, critiquing policy or identifying some challenge, you should have something to say about what to do about it. And that's, often not the most scintillating part of the foreign affairs piece when you kind of get to the end and arrive at policy recommendations, because, sometimes those are, policy recommendations don't have to be interesting to be good. So that is a place where we'll kind of often the substantive considerations might outweigh the editorial ones or the kind of aesthetic ones in some sense. But as as I think about different pieces and I think about what looks like success to us, there are times when, saying, look, let's try to step back and look at something like the course of Venezuela over the last, the last couple of decades. And I'm thinking of a piece called Venezuela's Suicide from a couple of years ago by Moises Naim and Francisco Toro, which is still very much worth reading. And it's not about, it's less about some big idea, some new insight that would totally change the way you think about the course of Venezuela, but is an attempt to kind of really tell the kind of a comprehensive, authoritative story of what has happened. So, that's a piece I point people to, or that kind of piece, as the kind of one thing you really should read to understand this past couple of decades. And there are lots of specifics in it that do have policy implications and kind of change the frame of thinking about a specific problem. But the value of it is really saying, this is going to be a comprehensive, authoritative, distillation of thinking and history on this issue. And there are others where there's, a very concrete, really concrete policy outcome. And, sometimes it's always nice for us to hear that, the Secretary of Defense has brought an author in to talk about some, criticism they've made, or, in other contexts, the foundation has set up a program that responds to some need that has been highlighted in a piece. But, every once in a while, I can think of one recent example that I'll mention. You'll have a policy recommendation that just kind of becomes policy in a very, very direct way. So we ran, sort of been a couple years ago now, a piece by a public health researcher named Caitlin Rivers, writing with a colleague whose name I'm forgetting, talking about our lack of a pandemic awareness system, like a meteorological center for public health and for pandemics, which was, as we all know now, a major shortcoming in the U.S. response to COVID in the early days. And shortly after that, maybe within a year of the article being published, the U.S. government set up a pandemic preparedness center, I'm forgetting the exact name of it, and brought in this woman to run it. And so, that was an instance where you have the kind of, very, very direct impact, which is incredibly satisfying. But there are other cases where, knowing that a piece is used widely on syllabi in colleges or grad schools is really important in kind of shaping thinking. Or, there are times when it's sparked a debate about a very specific policy issue among a narrower policy community, then kind of later percolates into broader debate. And one example of this piece from a couple of years ago about Taiwan and the question of strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity, right? Should the U.S. say very, very explicitly, if Taiwan is attacked by forces from mainland China, the U.S. will respond militarily? And that is not currently our policy. We ran a piece about 2 years ago arguing that should change. It was, much debated among the people who spend a lot of time thinking about this and who understood the stakes of that. Probably not, didn't a lot of, broader readers would not quite have registered the importance of that at the time. But this has become, in part because of, Joe Biden's occasional comments, whether intended or not, on changing U.S. policy and strategic ambiguity, has become a much broader debate. So being able to kind of look back and track something that starts as a somewhat narrower debate and then becomes more public over time is just another way of measuring that impact. So we're lucky to be part of a nonprofit and to have very loyal subscribers who stick around kind of year after year. And that kind of allows us to focus on, impact broadly defined. We, part of that is subscriptions and traffic and the things that if you're in a, more standard magazine, you spend all of your time thinking about, or much of your time thinking about. And, we want people to read as many people as possible to read a piece, but being able to have a, somewhat broader and more comprehensive sense of what impact and mission is, I think is really lucky.
Let's talk for a couple of minutes about your Centennial edition, which we call the Age of Uncertainty. And I might even just say, for any professors who are teaching American foreign policy next semester and looking for a textbook, you could do a lot worse than just spend the whole semester reading this and dissecting it. Just some amazing, interesting articles. And I want to ask you just more broadly, as you're thinking about putting together this Centennial issue, there's a little pressure on you. This is going to sit on people's shelves for a few years, hopefully more even than that. So as you approach this special publication, what were you thinking?
So above all, I wanted it to be a really good issue of Foreign Affairs, right? I wanted to be a copy of the magazine, issue of the magazine that showed kind of a clear sense of who we are and what we're trying to do, and just did it very well. So rather than we spent a lot of time saying, is there some more specific frame or prompt or question that we should focus the issue on? Ultimately, it was a matter of saying, look, let's step back and look at some kind of really big questions that we in the kind of broader foreign policy, international affairs world should be thinking and talking about, and try to take some big swings at saying something about them. And that's everything from if I think about that issue, there's China and Russia, there's the fate of American democracy around the world. There is, the kind of long-term threat of climate change and technology. So, trying to bring those together in a way that, it's not meant to read as a kind of coherent argument about anything, but that I think provides a pretty, hope it provides a smart and interesting kind of sense of where the world is and where the world is going. There's a part of that issue that I'm particularly fond of. We have 10 regular book reviewers who review books on in a variety of fields every issue, and we asked each of them to say to offer 2 or 3 books that to their mind are most essential to understanding the past century, and then 2 or 3 that are most essential to understanding the century ahead. And it's a very fun read in my foreign policy nerd opinion, but also just provides a kind of great sense of what people have been arguing about and thinking about looking backwards, but then also just some really good book recommendations going forward. So I think a lot of these pieces are sort of at that intersection of history and then consideration of the decades ahead.
Well, I mean, the first essay was remarkable, and it's by a young historian from Oxford, William McCaskill, who is part of this movement, kind of a long-term perspective on really humanity. And I want to read just a couple sentences because it certainly prompted some pretty intense thinking for me. He begins by saying, on the scale of the typical human life, humanity today is barely an infant struggling to walk. Although the future of our species may be long, it may instead be fleeting. Of the many developments that have occurred since this magazine's first issue a century ago, the most profound is humanity's ability to end itself. From climate change to nuclear war, engineered pandemics, uncontrolled artificial intelligence, and other destructive technologies not yet foreseen, a worrying number of risks conspire to threaten the end of humanity. That got my attention. I mean, and it's a very, very thoughtful essay about just our obligation to the future. And I think he says that, it could be that 12 trillion people follow us, 10 or 12 trillion, I forget the exact number is, but if we don't do some smart things, this really could end almost any time. I mean, talk about the article more broadly, and also just the decision to lead with it. It really is one of these kind of paradigm altering articles.
Yeah, I mean, so Will McCaskill is at Oxford. He's actually a philosopher by training. That has this very kind of broad historical scope, as you know. And what I found powerful about that article and about his thinking more broadly is that it is in part an argument about the kind of ethical obligations of decision makers now and how you kind of think about costs and benefits over a much longer time scale. It's in part about shaping policy decisions on that set of really complicated issues that you just ran through. But it also makes clear that we're at I think there's a tendency among people now to look at political debates and kind of political theory debates of previous decades or centuries as wider ranging, more unsettled, more uninteresting, with more space for broad disagreement and new ideas than we have now. I think there's often this sense of a kind of narrowing of some of those debates and just kind of stepping back and offering that perspective for someone who's not quite as enmeshed day to day in the foreign policy conversation. I think really kind of corrects that lament, right? It kind of makes clear that all of these questions are going to be more interesting, and why the debates should be wider ranging, and the solutions are going to be more challenging, but also are going to require kind of broader range of considerations than we think. So just as a kind of way of saying, look, there's a kind of I think for everyone in the field, the kind of tendency to look back at previous rounds of these debates as wider ranging, more interesting, less settled, and I think that you kind of read the McCaskill and you really sit up and say, oh, that's not true, right? This is actually more interesting, as consequential, maybe more consequential if you accept some of his warnings about technology and climate change. And so that to me was a really useful kind of intellectual wake up call for everyone as you get into the issue. So it was not in some ways not the kind of traditional lead that you would expect in a Centennial issue of Foreign Affairs, but I thought it really kind of usefully framed the conversation. Then you get into great articles about the course of China and Russia and U.S. foreign policy and American democracy. But I think kind of having that context to help frame those was valuable.
Yeah. And the second one I might say is by Richard Haas, who was a guest on this program about a year ago. And he describes, this kind of trifecta of challenges between, the big geopolitical challenges, the new quote new challenges of climate and pandemic, and then with the decline in American democracy. And he says the convergence of these three factors pose just extraordinary challenges during this age of uncertainty that we're in now.
Yeah, it's a really sort of bracing and scary way of thinking about it. In that, we have, I think the last the last year has kind of brought this home very, very clearly for people. You have this set of forces and concerns that I think felt antiquated, right? Felt historical to a lot of people, and some of this is geopolitics or military considerations that a lot of people thought of as kind of relics of a different time. Nuclear strategy, where people are spending a lot of time thinking about or worrying about this week, with Vladimir Putin making noise about nuclear use. So you have this set of concerns and questions that seem to come from a different decade, intersecting with this whole new set of challenges. And one of the kind of dimension of this that Richard Haass focuses on is this overlay of kind of global problems, right? That if you're going to solve climate change or deal with the possibility of runaway artificial intelligence or something like that, you kind of that is truly a global problem that's going to require a global solution. But you have rising geopolitical tensions and frictions and war, which makes the kind of path to solutions, the normal path to solutions, seem much harder. So that intersection, along with, of course, the if you are approaching this from an American policy perspective, the state of our own political system just makes that uniquely challenging. And that Richard calls it the most dangerous decade, and it's really that kind of intersection of the old and new that makes it so challenging. And I think you see versions of that in a lot of pieces here that are fundamentally about how we think about challenges going forward, but draw on history, I think, a lot more than might have been the case if you'd been doing something like this. I haven't gone back and compared the 75th issue on this 75th anniversary on this particular question, but this kind of need to look back at history to kind of to try to understand some of what's coming in the years ahead, I think has been really brought home by the confluence of crises that we're facing right now.
Well, let's talk about George Marshall and the China Mission, which, as I said, is a terrific book. And as a biographer, I think you've done something that every biographer dreams, which is you found a subject who is, deeply admired, hugely consequential, very interesting, and yet found a part of his career that relatively little has been written about, and it's actually a consequential part. First of all, how did you stumble into this notion? And we're talking about a 13-month period where Marshall effectively tried to mediate the end of a civil war in China. This was right at the end of World War II. So how did you stumble into this kind of important story that had been relatively untold?
So it goes back to my time working in the State Department and the policy planning staff, where as we discussed earlier, Marshall and Kennan just kind of loom over everything, and the kind of mythology of that period. And the Marshall Plan is still, I think, with reason, seen as the kind of great achievement of American statecraft in certainly in the 20th century, and maybe one of the greatest ever. And when you're in a policy position, there's this constant pressure to come up with something like the Marshall Plan, or containment would be another example of this, right? That these guys did these incredibly formative, consequential things, and that's what we should be doing. And so you spend a lot of time looking at the Marshall Plan. You often read columns from outside observers saying we need a Marshall Plan for X problem, and that's kind of endlessly repeated. So I'd spent a lot of time thinking about Marshall in that context, but there's this incredible 13 months that comes in between Marshall's time as Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and really one of the key architects of American and Allied victory in World War II, and then his becoming Secretary of State and doing the Marshall Plan and being really formative in creating the Cold War strategy, early Cold War strategy. And it's this 13 months when he's taking on one of the biggest and most consequential problems in the world and failing to achieve it. And that, to me, part of the question for me was, how did that shape his thinking as he then goes into become Secretary of State and goes on to lead the Marshall Plan and do all these other things? But also, how does that kind of this thing that we've kind of forgotten, has fallen out of the at least dominant narrative of American foreign policy, how does that kind of reverberate through the US-China relationship and through our own thinking about Asia and about the world, really through today? So a big part of it was my wanting answers to those questions, right? I wanted to read the book, and the book didn't exist, so I went out and wrote it. And then it's also just this I hope comes through in the reading of it, but certainly with the thing that kept me going at it for 5 or 6 years as I was researching the book, is that just this amazing human story on some level. The kind of narrative of it is really incredible, and that you have these both famous historical figures. So you have Marshall and Eisenhower and Mao and Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek and MacArthur, all kind of working through these incredibly consequential, hard problems, and at this very human scale, kind of face to face, and trying to come up with a path forward, and kind of seeing these enormous foreign policy decisions and things of world historical consequence kind of being worked out in this short timeline at a human scale was really amazing. And then a lot of not, less famous characters who are on the margins of this or involved in it in less prominent ways. And just, being able to go back and, you're sitting in a university, but all of the libraries and archives and universities and presidential libraries and elsewhere that just have this just incredible material from people who are sitting, writing diaries after being in meetings or sending letters to their, spouses or children or whatever, and being able to kind of see the human dimension of these, historical decisions was really, really powerful for me. So part of it is just the story of it I found really fascinating, even leaving aside the implications for subsequent decades and for U.S. foreign policy and everything else.
Well, I saw a talk that you gave I think it was at Yale, and you were saying that one of the challenges of a biographer is to inhabit the world of his or her subject. And it struck me that, and this is not a novel observation, inhabiting the world of George Marshall is really hard, because he was one of the most formidably remote people who's been involved in American diplomacy. As you point out, some of this image was carefully structured by himself, but he was not a person who said a lot. He was very, very taciturn, listened more than he spoke. Did not reveal his innermost feelings to anyone except maybe Mrs. Marshall, as he once said. I mean, how do you inhabit the world of George Marshall? I mean, did you feel like you were able to kind of really understand what made him tick?
He's this great stoic, as you say. He doesn't keep a diary, doesn't talk a lot about his, about anything personal. He very famously always refused to write a memoir. When he was in retirement, publishers would kind of throw money at him to write his memoirs. He was this kind of amazing figure of both World War II and then of American foreign policy subsequently. And he would say two things. He would say, I don't want to profit off my public service by taking, a big check from a publisher to write my memoir. And then, to be honest about it, I would have to offend too many people who I care about. And I just don't, it's not worth it to me. So he never writes the memoir that would have, kind of shaped the historical impression of who he was. I tried to kind of think of this as not that I was inside of George Marshall's head, but that I was, you as the reader, or I as the writer, were kind of, the close aid walking through these decisions with him. So what was really, critical to doing that was finding the letters and diaries and notes from some of these kind of young officers, diplomats, others who were with him, 16 hours a day through this period, and reporting what he said in the moment, what was said in the meeting, but then also what they were saying in the hallway afterwards, or what, they were saying over drinks or dinner. So really trying to kind of fill out this picture through some of the people around him, which, I think gives you a pretty good sense of what Marshall thinks, but he's a very, very self-contained person. So in some ways, my solution in the book was to, give you, rather than, straight through his eyes, a kind of over the shoulder feeling and reading it, which is as much from the people around him as it is from him. But in doing so, I hope to give you a kind of richer picture of this character who's seen in this kind of gray Olympian terms, like he's like a carved out of stone. But when you get these really moment to moment impressions from people who were with him in these very intense and interesting situations. You just get a more human picture, even if you don't know at every second what he is saying and what his deepest feelings are.
Well, I won't spoil the book for people because I really would urge them to read it. And, in brief, Marshall is trying to bring together two warring, factions in China, the communists and the nationalists. He jumps in intensely, feels like, he's been able to broker a truce. Seems like will be able to stop the civil war, maybe to even develop a unified army, agreement on democratic principles. So he puts together a framework. And then, as time unfolds, it crumbles. And in the end, he realizes that there just really isn't much he can do. I want to read one of your concluding thoughts. And I know it's been read back to you a lot of times. I've seen the interviews, but it's still, in terms of just summarizing Marshall and the challenge he faces. It's hard to do better than what you did. And what you say, more than any other figure in that narrative, George Marshall embodies the conception of American leadership at its best. Strong, generous, bold. The greatest generation venerated his greatness, the wise men his wisdom. The China mission cuts against that conception of American power that Marshall and his era may have been taken to represent. It is a story not of possibility and ambition, but of limit and restraint, not of victory achieved at any cost, but of a kind of failure ultimately accepted as the best of terrible options. Perhaps not surprisingly, the common understanding of Marshall and his accomplishments has tended to leave out his time in China altogether. Talk about, and I guess your central point is, here is our best diplomat, arguably, working at the zenith of American power after World War II, coming to learn that, for all of his, his accomplishments and all of his skills and all the power base that he works from, he could not compel another country and its leaders to do something that they were unwilling to do.
That's right. You've captured it really well. You have this this commanding figure who has just really put together the most incredible war effort the world's ever seen. He's really kind of built the modern American army from something that was not adequate to winning World War II when he took over in 1939 to this just kind of obviously incredible operation. And he takes on this problem that is seen as kind of essential to, takes on this challenge, this mission that is seen as really essential to realizing the American vision of post-war order, and spends these 13 months at first thinking that he's pulled it off, that he gets these kind of early agreements between the communists and nationalists. He has a whole plan for American assistance. Something that's a sort of like a Marshall Plan for China in some ways. He has a plan to bring these long warring armies together, and then watches that fall apart. And in watching it fall apart and reckoning with the options, you see him, not just come to terms with the limits of power, with the limits of what outside influence or military power can achieve, but also an understanding of what it will take for transformative statecraft to succeed elsewhere. So one of the really interesting things here is not just Marshall kind of learning to see the limits of power and then becoming a real skeptic of an American military intervention in China before Mao wins in 1949. There's a debate as the communists come closer to winning the Civil War about whether sending more American troops there, putting American commanders in charge, what can be done to solve this challenge to American interests as it's seen at the time. And Marshall becomes someone who says, I don't think that any application of American power, given the resources that we're able to apply to it, is going to fundamentally change the outcome. And so it's best for us to kind of accept that restraint and reckon honestly with the limits of power. But it also really becomes formative in helping him shape the Marshall Plan and shape American strategy going forward, and kind of recognizing that some of the key dimensions of success of these initiatives have to do with whether people can be fed and have jobs. That we think about these questions of geopolitical competition in certain kind of abstract terms, but it comes down to some ways these very, very human considerations. And so when Marshall's kind of shaping the Marshall Plan and selling it to the American people, kind of making the case for this investment in Western Europe, you see him kind of bringing the lessons of that experience in China, which was ultimately a failure, and turning it into what becomes this great success. So this is not it doesn't totally change the picture of Marshall, but I think it really complicates it, and that you see that both you really need to kind of understand both sides of these achievements in this era to have an accurate picture of who he was and what was at the core of American strategy in that moment.
Well, as you pointed out, there's a lot of mythology about this era, the wise men, in which American foreign policy, I think you'd have to argue, was quite successful, after World War II and had enduring accomplishments. The question, of course, everyone asks is, why don't we produce George Marshalls anymore, or do we produce them, but our institutions do not allow them to succeed? Are they running universities? Are they leaving diplomacy in the military? I mean, what is your take on just whether the United States can produce people of the caliber of Marshall, if we still are producing people of that stature and wisdom and maybe even humility too?
I mean, so Marshall is a really extraordinary figure. So I have a hard time pointing to someone and saying this is another Marshall. Yet at the same time, I think if Marshall were here, he'd say, of course there are other Marshalls, right? It's easy to look back at these figures once they become mythologized and see them as kind of almost inhumanly great, where there's kind of Olympian quality to them. But it's notable at the time that Marshall was a controversial figure in many ways. He wasn't kind of unopposed during World War II. You see these, arguments with Churchill and with others in the U.S. military, and then after this experience in China, he becomes one of the chief targets of Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, in part because of what he did in China. So we kind of can leave out some of those less rosy parts of the history and look back through, with a degree of nostalgia that I think makes these stories and these figures look less complicated than they in fact were at the time. I assume that we will look back, or subsequent generations will look back on this generation and have a similar sense of these great figures that couldn't possibly be replicated. I will say, I mean, this cuts somewhat against that, but I think the World War II experience of all of these figures kind of coming together in this, truly national war effort had an extraordinary effect in kind of bringing some of these figures to the surface. But I think there are other kinds of challenges other than war that can have a similar effect on figures now. So I try to remember that if Marshall were here with us, he would scoff at the premise of your question and say, of course there are other Marshalls today.
What other books? What's your next book? I saw an interview in which you said that you were thinking about a book maybe dealing with a U.S. foreign policy in the 1970s and the question of intervention. Has that proceeded? I
wish I could tell you it had. I have been very consumed with with my day job, which has been it is a privilege and a very satisfying way to spend my day. So it's not a complaint, but I have not figured out what the next book is. I hope to at some point soon, but there's a lot to spend time on in the world today without making time to go back to that history personally. So.
Right. Well, a couple of final questions. One, I mean, we have students listening to this discussion, and what kind of advice would you give to them, those who envision a career like yours in which they work in government, journalism, the think tank world? I mean, what have you learned? What would you say that they might think about as they start pondering their careers?
So it's a great question. I mean, I think part of my career has been kind of a little bit strange in that I've worked in a few different fields, but kind of try to remind people, that there's not exactly a formula. I couldn't have gone back to my 20-year-old self and say, okay, I'm going to lay out the strategy to do this specific set of things. But I had a pretty clear set of right. I had a very clear interest in foreign policy in this set of questions. And I was always, fairly opportunistic in some ways about saying, okay, what's the best way for me to, in this particular moment, get at this this set of questions, find a way to work on that. And there are times when that's going to be government. There are times when it's going to be, writing books. There are times when it's going to be editing, but kind of looking for the right opportunity in a way that I could not possibly plan in advance, but always with that sense that I have a very clear thing that I want to be working on and thinking about and spending my time on. It helps that's, if I had, ended up doing something totally different, it's probably what I would spend my free time thinking about and reading about anyway. So that makes it much easier to work long hours and, commit yourself to a job. I would also say, it's worth thinking about what not just the topic is, but the task that you find satisfying and you're good at. So for me, writing and editing and working with words is a way that is kind of a satisfying way for me to interact with material. It is something that I bring to the topic, and knowing what you're good at, not just the topic that you want to be working on, and finding a way to bring those together, I think is another useful formula. But I think that the biggest thing for me is having both a clear sense of the topics and issues you want to be working on, but being willing to move around and try different things and be a little bit flexible and opportunistic in finding the specific job, rather than saying I'm going to try to plan my career and have a set of steps that I'm gonna play out over the next 30 years, because I certainly couldn't have done it. And then just the last thing I would say, especially for people who really want to work on foreign policy or public policy, the Foreign Service is an amazing career track if you want to be working in diplomacy. There are civil service tracks in the Pentagon, or U.S. Agents for International Development. I mean, there are really interesting ways into those careers, and they allow you to work on a really interesting range of issues to, I think, really, really quickly be having, making high impact decisions and offering policy ideas. So I think there are really, really great tracks in the public service for people who want to be working on these things. And that's not what I did when I was 22, but for anyone who says I want to be working on foreign policy, I would just urge students to look at the set of programs and tracks that take you straight into it.
Let me ask you finally, I see some books in the background. I mean, how do you like to relax? Do you relax by reading biography, history, or do you try to just find a way to kind of just take at least some time away from those worlds?
So I read a lot of fiction. I think probably most of those books that you're looking at behind me are novels or books of short stories. So, to me, that's really essential. And part it's relaxing, but I think it kind of gives you different perspective on the set of issues and human qualities that you're dealing with day to day. And I was actually recommended someone was asking about books about foreign policy a couple of days ago, and asking about kind of how institutions work. And the best book I could think of to explain how, kind of international institutions work is a book of short stories by a woman named Shirley Hazard, who had worked in the UN earlier in her career, and then wrote this book of stories that are just about the people working at the UN. And to me, it was something I read for pleasure, because I love her fiction, not because I, wanted to learn about the UN or how international institutions work. But to me, it was just such a kind of amazing portrait of the human dimension of this. So, I don't think of that fiction reading as part of my job, but it certainly kind of plays into the way I think about things, and can be very, very powerful. And sometimes, more constructive and more powerful than, reading the nonfiction book. So that's a personal taste for me, but one that I think has value.
Oh, I'm going to have to read it, because I actually have her memoir about working in the UN, which I've just read bits of, and it's this very, very unsparing account of that institution.
I think the stories are better and maybe more.
Okay, I'll have to look at that.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for your time. This has been really a terrific discussion. And I want to just recommend to our listeners, you can get these in newsstands across the country, and it really some very, very provocative and interesting articles. And also Dan's book, China Mission. Everyone should be interested in George Marshall, but this is a remarkable account in which we see him, in some sense in failure, but kind of a noble failure, and then learning from it and continuing to grow and to really serve the country in important ways. Well written, very, very stimulating read. So Dan, thank you for your time, and we look forward to continuing to follow your work.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks everyone, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Perfect. Well, thanks
Thank you.
everyone for watching another edition of our Understanding Our New World series. We will have a video of this on our website. Please look at it, show it to family and friends, and thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.